The fingers went first, not the whole hand. Just the tips, a slow, creeping numbness that started at the nails and crawled inward like something alive. You wouldn't notice it at first, not when you were still shaking. Shaking was good. Shaking meant your body was still fighting. It was when the shaking stopped that the real dying began. And in January of 1431, across a frozen stretch of northern France, the shaking had stopped for thousands of people who would never shake again. Their bodies lay stiff in cottages, in barns, in ditches along roads that no cart had traveled in weeks because the mud had turned to iron and the oxen were already dead. The air didn't smell like winter. It smelled like nothing. Cold that deep kills smell itself. The only scent left was the faint, acrid trace of smoke from hearths burning furniture, because the firewood had run out 2 weeks ago. This was not a normal winter. This was the winter that broke medieval Europe. And everything you think you know about how people survived the Middle Ages, the cozy tavern scenes, the roaring fireplaces, the hearty stews, is a lie told by paintings and Hollywood and your 7th grade history textbook. The truth is uglier, wetter, colder, and far more desperate than any of us sitting in our heated homes can begin to imagine. The 1430s weren't supposed to happen. For roughly 3 centuries before, Europe had enjoyed what climatologists call the medieval warm period, a stretch of relatively mild temperatures that allowed vineyards to flourish as far north as England and southern Scandinavia. Farmers pushed their fields higher into the hills. Population boomed, cathedrals rose. It felt to the people living through it like God's favor made visible in the weather itself. Then, sometime around the early 1300s, the warmth began to retreat. Slowly at first. A bad harvest here, a longer frost there. Vineyards that had thrived in Yorkshire withered and died. Farmers who had pushed their fields up the Norwegian hillsides watched the soil freeze earlier each autumn and thaw later each spring. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 killed millions and gave Europe its first real taste of what was coming. 3 years of relentless rain that rotted crops in the ground, drove grain prices to 10 times their normal levels, and reduced entire communities to eating dogs, cats, and the bark off trees. Reports of cannibalism surfaced in Ireland and the Baltic. The Black Death followed in 1348 and cut the continent's population nearly in half. Villages vanished. Fields returned to forest. The survivors inherited a broken world with more land than hands to work it. But even after those horrors, even after decades of plague and war, nothing prepared them for the cold that descended in the winter of 1431. According to research published by the University of Bern and the European Geosciences Union, the 1430s represent what may be the coldest decade of the entire last millennium. Climate reconstructions drawn from tree rings, ice cores, lake sediments, and hundreds of historical documents paint a picture of extraordinary cold that had no single volcanic or solar cause. It was, in the language of climate science, a rare alignment of natural variability, a freak accident of atmosphere and ocean currents that plunged European winters into sustained brutal cold, while summers remained deceptively normal. The people living through it had no framework for understanding this. They had no thermometers, no satellite data, no weather forecasts. They had only their animals, their prayers, and the slow realization that the world was turning against them. To understand what the winter of 1431 actually felt like, you have to forget everything about your modern life. Forget insulation, forget central heating, forget the thermostat you adjust without thinking. Now imagine a house, not a house like yours, a single-room structure with walls made of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The floor is packed earth. The roof is thatch. There is one opening that functions as a window, but it has no glass. It has a wooden shutter that lets in a blade of cold air no matter how tightly you press it closed. In the center of this room sits an open hearth, a shallow pit of stones where a fire burns. When you have something to burn, there is no chimney. Smoke rises and fills the upper half of the room before slowly escaping through a hole in the thatch. Your eyes water constantly. Your lungs ache. The ceiling beams above you are black with decades of accumulated soot. This is where an entire family lives. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, and in the coldest months, sometimes the animals too. A cow, a few goats, maybe a pig, brought inside not out of affection, but because their body heat was the difference between surviving the night and not surviving it. The smell was extraordinary. Dung, sweat, smoke, wet wool that never fully dried because there wasn't enough heat to dry it. You wore your clothes to bed. You wore them for weeks without washing because water had to be hauled from a well or a stream. And in January of 1431, the streams were frozen solid and the wells had ice 2 inches thick at the surface. A peasant family in northern France or the Low Countries in that winter would wake before dawn, not by choice, by cold. The fire had died sometime in the early hours, and the temperature inside the house had dropped to a point where sleep became impossible. The mother, and it was almost always the mother, would rise first. She would kneel at the hearth and try to coax the embers back to life with whatever fuel remained. In a normal winter, this would be split logs harvested in autumn, stacked and dried under an overhang. But by January of 1431, that supply was often long gone. Families burned furniture, they burned fence posts, they burned the handles of tools they would desperately need come spring. Some burned straw from their own roofs, a suicidal bargain. Warmth tonight, exposure tomorrow. Breakfast, if you could call it that, was a piece of bread so hard it had to be soaked in whatever liquid was available. Water, weak ale, or the thin broth left over from last night's pottage. This bread was not the crusty artisanal loaf you're imagining. It was dark, dense, made from rye or barley flour that was often cut with ground acorns, dried peas, or even sawdust when the grain ran low. Wheat bread was a luxury most peasants never tasted. The grain for this bread had been ground by hand, often by the women of the household using a stone quern, a process that took hours of repetitive back-breaking labor. In many regions, the local lord owned the only mill, and peasants were legally required to grind their grain there and pay a tax for the privilege. If the lord's mill was frozen, and in 1431, water mills across Europe stood silent, their wheels locked in ice, you ground it yourself or you didn't eat. The pottage that sustained most families through winter was a thick stew made from whatever was available. Onions, cabbage, turnips, dried peas, lentils, a handful of barley. If you were fortunate, a piece of salted pork or a strip of smoked bacon that had been preserved in autumn. Everything went into a single iron pot that hung over the hearth and was rarely emptied completely. Yesterday's remnants became the base for today's meal. Fruit was almost unheard of in winter, and when it was available, it was never eaten raw. Medieval people believed uncooked fruit caused illness, so anything from an apple to a pear was boiled into the pottage along with everything else. The caloric intake for a peasant family in a hard winter hovered around 1,500 to 1,800 calories per day for adults performing hard physical labor. Modern nutritionists would call this slow starvation. Water was not safe to drink. Wells were often contaminated, streams were shared with livestock, and the concept of waterborne disease was still centuries away from being understood. So people drank ale, not the strong beer of modern pubs, but a weak, cloudy brew made from barley that had barely enough alcohol to kill the worst bacteria. Even children drank it. Brewing was one of the few trades commonly practiced by women, and in many villages, the alewife was as essential to survival as the blacksmith. But brewing required fuel, firewood to heat the water, grain to ferment, and in the winter of 1431, both were vanishing. If you've ever wondered what medieval people did all winter, the answer is they tried not to die. The romantic notion of peasants gathered around a roaring fire telling stories or playing games is a fantasy drawn from the lives of the wealthy. For common people, winter was a season of enforced stillness. You moved as little as possible to conserve calories. You slept as much as possible to conserve heat. Some families in rural France reportedly practiced a form of semi-hibernation, sleeping up to 16 hours a day, rising only to tend the fire and eat. One account from rural Russia described peasants who woke once a day, ate a single piece of hard bread, checked the fire, and went back to sleep. Entire households entered a kind of suspended animation. Bodies wrapped in every available covering, huddled in darkness, breathing the slow, shallow breaths of people who had unconsciously learned that stillness was the price of another sunrise. This wasn't laziness. It was survival arithmetic. Every movement burned energy. Every calorie spent had to be replaced, and the food was running out. The animals were dying too. Livestock that hadn't been slaughtered in November for winter provisions were now starving in their pens. Hay stored in autumn ran short. Pastures were buried under snow and ice. Cattle grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Sheep froze standing in fields. And when the animals died, their owners lost not just food but wealth. A single cow represented years of investment for a peasant family, and its death could mean the difference between recovery in spring and total destitution. In some regions, desperate farmers bled their living cattle and mixed the blood with oats to make a crude sustenance cake. This wasn't cruelty. This was Tuesday. If you're still watching this and you've never thought about what a medieval winter actually looked like from the ground, from inside that dark, smoky, freezing room, hit the like button, because this story deserves to be heard by more people than just us. Now stretch this desperation across an entire continent. In the winter of 1431 and into 1432, rivers across Central Europe froze solid. The Rhine, the Danube. Lakes that hadn't frozen in living memory turned to ice thick enough to walk across. In the Low Countries, modern Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, canals that served as the arteries of trade and transport became impassable. Commerce ground to a halt. In Scotland, wine froze inside bottles, and people had to hold the glass over a flame just to get a liquid sip. In southern France and northern Italy, regions accustomed to mild winters, the cold persisted into April, with late frosts destroying crops that had barely begun to sprout. This wasn't a brief cold snap. This was a season-long siege. And through all of this, Europe was also at war. The 100 Years' War between England and France had been grinding on since 1337. Nearly a century of intermittent battles, sieges, chevauchés, the deliberate burning and pillaging of enemy territory that left entire regions depopulated and desolate. By 1431, English forces controlled large portions of northern France, including Paris and Normandy. The great English victory at Agincourt in 1415 had shattered French military confidence, and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had effectively handed the French crown to the English king. French peasants were caught between occupying armies, roving bands of mercenaries who called themselves soldiers but behaved like bandits, and a feudal taxation system that extracted grain, livestock, and labor regardless of whether the people had anything left to give. Taxes didn't pause for famine. Teeths didn't pause for frost. The Lord's share came first, always. What the peasant kept was whatever the Lord didn't want. The same year that thousands froze and starved, a 19-year-old peasant girl named Joan of Arc was burned alive at the stake in Rouen on May 30th. The English convicted her of heresy for wearing men's clothing and claiming divine visions. The real crime was that she had dared to give the French hope. The smoke from her pyre rose into the spring air of a continent still thawing from a winter that had killed far more people than any English army. The cruelty of 1431 was compounded by what came after. Because the cold destroyed winter crops, The following spring and summer brought famine. Grain prices surged. Bread, the single most important food source for every class of society, became scarce and expensive. The poor, already weakened by months of malnutrition, became vulnerable to disease. Dysentery, typhus, influenza. These epidemics swept through populations whose immune systems had been hollowed out by hunger. In some regions of the Low Countries, contemporary chronicles record that the dead were too numerous to bury individually, and mass graves were dug in frozen ground by men who could barely lift a shovel. And the wolves came. This detail sounds like fiction, but it is documented in multiple sources. When winters were severe enough and long enough, wolf packs that normally stayed deep in the forests followed the scent of death closer and closer to human settlements. In the 1430s, wolves became a genuine threat to communities across France. Starving packs entered villages. They attacked livestock in pens. There are accounts of wolves entering the outskirts of Paris itself. In 1450, the culmination of 2 decades of harsh winters and social collapse, a pack of wolves terrorized Paris, reportedly killing 40 people before the citizens organized a hunt and drove them out. The wolves were not monsters. They were hungry, just like the people they preyed upon. But here is the part of this story that the chronicles rarely tell, because the chroniclers, monks, clerics, minor nobility, were writing from behind stone walls with fireplaces and stored grain. The people who actually survived the winter of 1431 were not the people who wrote about it. They were the women who rose before dawn to keep the fire alive. The mothers who fed their children first and ate last, or didn't eat at all. The old men who mended nets and sharpened tools by firelight so that when spring finally came, if it came, the household could plant and fish and maybe, just barely, begin again. They were the alewives who brewed weak beer in the dark, the shepherds who slept in the barn with their remaining sheep, sharing body heat with animals they'd known by name since birth. These people left no memoirs. They carved no tombstones. Their names exist in no archive. But they endured. They endured because human beings are, at their core, brutally good at refusing to die. They rationed every crumb. They stuffed every crack in the walls with mud and straw. They wore every piece of clothing they owned simultaneously. Linen against the skin, wool over that, leather over the wool, a cloak of whatever animal hide could be spared on top. This was not fashion. This was engineering. Wool was the critical layer. Its crimped fibers trapped tiny pockets of air that held body heat, and it retained warmth even when wet, which was essential because nothing was ever truly dry. The wealthy wore fur-lined cloaks with the animal pelt turned inward against the wool for maximum insulation. The poor wore whatever they had: rags, sacking, straw stuffed into shoes that were falling apart. Frostbite was epidemic. Fingers, toes, ears. The body sacrificed its extremities to keep its core alive, and there was no surgeon who could help. A blackened toe was cut off with a knife sterilized by nothing but hope, and you went on. They heated stones in the hearth and carried them wrapped in cloth to bed, pressing them against their bodies for the few hours of warmth they held. Families slept in a single pile. Parents, children, grandparents tangled together under every blanket and animal skin the household possessed. Privacy was a concept that belonged to the rich. Warmth belonged to everyone who could press close enough. They told their children that spring was coming, even when they no longer believed it themselves. And spring did come. It always does, eventually. The ice on the rivers cracked and broke apart with sounds like cannon fire. Meltwater flooded the frozen fields and turned the roads to rivers of mud. The survivors stumbled out of their hovels into a world that looked nothing like the one they'd known the previous autumn. Entire villages had been abandoned. Livestock had been wiped out. Fences, outbuildings, sometimes the very walls of houses had been burned for fuel. The landscape looked like the aftermath of a war, which, in many parts of France, it also was. plows sat rusting in barns. Seed grain that should have been saved for planting had been eaten in February when there was nothing else. The oxen that should have pulled those plows were dead or too weak to stand. A peasant who had somehow survived the winter now faced the equally terrifying prospect of a spring with nothing to plant and nothing to plant it with. Recovery, where it happened, took years. Some villages never recovered at all. Their names survive only in tax records and land surveys, a notation that such and such a village was waste or depopulated, a bureaucratic epitaph for a community that the cold had simply erased. If this story has changed how you think about the people who came before us, if it has made you pause and consider what survival actually meant for those who had nothing but their own endurance, subscribe to this channel, because there are thousands of stories like this one, buried in the silence of centuries, and they deserve to be brought into the light. The medieval peasants who survived the winter of 1431 did not think of themselves as heroes. They did not write books about resilience. They did not post inspirational quotes about overcoming hardship. They got up, they found something to burn, they found something to eat. They kept their children alive for one more day. And when enough of those days stacked up, it was March. Then April. Then the ground softened enough to push a seed into, and the whole brutal, beautiful cycle started over. We sit today in climate-controlled rooms, complaining about Wi-Fi speeds and delivery times, wrapped in more comfort than any medieval king could have imagined. We have central heating, refrigerators stocked with food from 6 continents, clean water that flows at the turn of a handle. We live by any historical measure, like gods, and yet we have lost something those frozen, starving, smoke-blackened peasants carried with them through the darkest nights of 1431. A bone-deep understanding that survival is not guaranteed, that warmth is not a right, that every meal is a small miracle earned by someone's labor, that the distance between abundance and oblivion is exactly one bad winter. They knew this. We have forgotten it, and perhaps that forgetting is the most dangerous cold of all.